The wind carried the faint smell of salt and gun oil as the team advanced along the broken coastline, their boots crunching against scattered pebbles and dried seaweed. The SEALs moved like shadows, disciplined, silent, deadly. Among them was someone who, only hours ago, had been the least likely person to march in step with America's most elite warriors. Her name was Leora, a combat medic who had always been defined by her gentle hands and steady voice, a healer who stitched torn flesh, reset shattered bones, and whispered promises of survival into the ears of men bleeding out under enemy fire. She had never been the one to take life, her purpose was to preserve it. But tonight was different. Tonight, something irreversible had shifted inside her, and every man on the team would carry the memory of what she did into the shadows of their nightmares, calling it unforgettable for the rest of their days. The mission had begun like countless others. A reconnaissance run on a hidden coastal facility where enemy operatives were suspected of staging weapons transfers. The SEALs knew the layout from drone scans, but there were always unknowns in the field. That was why Leora was brought along. She wasn't just a medic in this instance. She was also a language specialist, trained to decode the strange dialects spoken by the paramilitary group entrenched within the compound. Her rifle slung across her back was mostly ceremonial, a precaution rather than a weapon she was expected to use. Every man in the unit respected her presence, trusted her ability to patch them up under fire, but none imagined she would ever need to put her finger on the trigger. They were wrong. Fate doesn't always ask permission before rewriting who you are. They had moved quietly along the outer wall of the compound, the ocean's rhythmic crash muffling their approach. The team leader, Commander Reeves, signaled for a halt. His hand gestures were sharp, deliberate. 2 guards ahead, one on the tower, one patrolling near the cargo containers stacked like monoliths of rust and steel. The plan was swift and silent elimination. Leora crouched low behind a jagged boulder, her pulse steady, though she could feel the heat of her blood in her ears. She knew her role. Stay back. Provide cover if absolutely necessary. Patch wounds. Translate intercepted chatter. Nothing more. But when the first shot cracked through the night, when the man on the tower slumped lifelessly against the railing, the mission fractured into chaos. The patrolling guard had heard the faint thud of the body hitting the platform, and instead of running, he turned and unleashed a spray of bullets in blind panic. The air split with the whistle of lead, fragments of stone and sparks spraying dangerously close. One of the SEALs went down instantly, a round carving into his thigh, the arterial spurt vivid even in the moonlight. Leora's instincts ignited. She lunged to his side, dragging him behind cover, her hands already pressing into the wound, her kit spilling open in a blur of practiced efficiency. She wasn't afraid, she never was in the face of blood. Fear came from things unknown, but blood was something she understood deeply. She stabilized him, but as she worked, something happened that no training had prepared her for. From the corner of her vision she saw Reeves pinned. A second gunman had emerged from the shadows of the containers, moving with professional precision, laying down suppressive fire. Reeves was trapped, low on ammunition, and the others couldn't reposition without exposing themselves. Leora's gaze snapped between her patient and the commander. For a second she hesitated, her oath, her identity, demanded she remain with the wounded. But then the crack of incoming rounds kicked dust inches from Reeves's skull, and something ancient and primal surged through her chest. She felt her pulse change, not racing in panic, but slowing, sharpening, as if every beat of her heart aligned with a decision that had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. She released the pressure bandage for a fraction of a second, long enough to snatch the rifle slung uselessly across her back. The weapon felt alien at first, but her grip adjusted, her muscles remembering the training she had done reluctantly in boot camp. She rose from behind cover with the fluidity of someone possessed by purpose, her eyes narrowing into perfect focus. Time dilated. The chaos, the shouting, the ricochets, all of it receded into silence. She saw only the enemy's silhouette, the faint glint of his rifle's barrel, the pattern of his movement. Without conscious thought, her finger tightened on the trigger. One shot. A clean, brutal punctuation to the storm. The man collapsed before he could fire another round, his weapon clattering against the steel containers with an almost ceremonial finality. The battlefield shifted. For a breathless instant, no one moved. Reeves looked up, his face shadowed by disbelief, his lips parting as if to ask whether what had just happened was real. The SEAL pinned behind another crate leaned out, stunned that the gunman was down. And then Leora exhaled, her body trembling only slightly as the adrenaline caught up to her. She dropped back to her knees, returning instantly to her patient, pressing into the wound as though she hadn't just altered the fabric of her existence with a single lethal decision. But the SEALs saw it. They saw how the healer's hands had transformed in one heartbeat into the hands of a marksman. They didn't speak of it yet, but each man registered it, searing it into memory as something both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The mission pressed on. There was no time to dwell. With the immediate threat neutralized, Reeves regrouped the team, signaling advancement. They moved deeper into the compound, sweeping corners, clearing rooms, their progress punctuated by the sharp pop of suppressed gunfire. Leora remained at the rear, stabilizing her patient with one hand, weapon ready in the other. She wasn't supposed to be both healer and fighter, but tonight the rules no longer applied. She felt something awakening inside her, something dangerous and undeniable. She wasn't simply patching wounds anymore. She was preventing them by eliminating threats before they could strike. She was rewriting her role with every step, even if she didn't fully comprehend it yet. When they reached the inner yard, the scale of the operation revealed itself. Crates stacked high with weapons, vehicles half-loaded with supplies, a cluster of enemy soldiers too entrenched for a quiet extraction. Reeves cursed under his breath. They were outnumbered, cornered, and already carrying a casualty. Every instinct told him the mission was compromised. But before he could decide whether to call for extraction, Leora rose beside him. Her face was calm, her eyes sharp, and there was something in her bearing that made even seasoned warriors pause. She scanned the yard, her gaze calculating, and then she spoke with a conviction that startled even herself. "We can cut through them. Aim for the fuel drums near the trucks. One shot, chain reaction." It wasn't a suggestion. It was strategy born not from hesitation but from clarity. Reeves studied her for only a heartbeat before nodding. They followed her lead. The shot echoed like a thunderclap. Fire bloomed instantly, consuming the yard in a wave of chaos. Enemy soldiers scattered, some consumed in the blast, others disoriented by the sudden inferno. The SEALs advanced through the smoke, cutting down those who remained. And through it all, Leora moved with terrifying grace, her rifle rising and falling with precision, every round she fired hitting its mark. To the men who fought beside her, it was as if she had been carrying this dormant identity all along, waiting for the right night to reveal itself. By the time they secured the compound, silence falling heavy over the wreckage, every SEAL knew the truth. The healer who had always been their safety net had become something else entirely, something they would never forget. The compound smoldered behind them, its skeletal remains crackling with the sound of dying flames, the air heavy with smoke and the acrid sting of burned fuel. The SEALs moved quickly, carrying their wounded and sweeping for stragglers, but their eyes flicked often toward Leora. No one said anything yet. Their discipline kept them focused on extraction, but the weight of what they had witnessed clung to the silence. The healer had stepped beyond her oath, beyond her identity, and into something raw and deadly. The transformation hadn't been gradual, it had erupted in the span of a heartbeat. Reeves replayed the moment in his mind, the impossible accuracy of her shot, the clarity in her voice when she directed their assault, the way she had guided them with an authority that shouldn't have belonged to someone outside the unit. It wasn't training alone. It was instinct, something sharper, older, deeper. And it left him unsettled even as it saved them all. They pushed into the tree line bordering the coastline, a path that would lead them to the extraction point. The night was alive with distant gunfire, alarms from the compound echoing out like dying screams. The enemy would be mobilizing soon, and the SEALs had to vanish before reinforcements arrived. Leora carried her pack slung across her shoulders, the wounded SEAL leaning against her as she steadied him with surprising strength. She wasn't thinking about what had just happened, not yet. Her mind compartmentalized, focusing instead on the pressure of her patient's pulse beneath her fingers, the rhythm of his breathing. But beneath that surface, something had undeniably shifted. She no longer saw herself as a liability in a firefight. She no longer dismissed the rifle on her back as dead weight. She knew now, with chilling clarity, that when pressed, she could wield it with purpose, and that frightened her in ways she couldn't yet articulate. Reeves fell back in line beside her, glancing at the man she supported before speaking low enough that only she could hear. "That shot you took," he murmured, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Where the hell did that come from?" Leora didn't look at him. Her jaw tightened, her eyes fixed ahead on the dark forest path. "It came from where it needed to," she said, her tone flat, almost detached. Reeves studied her for a beat longer, trying to read the meaning behind her words, but her face revealed nothing. He nodded once and returned to the front of the column, though his thoughts churned. He had led countless operators, warriors forged through fire and blood, and yet what he saw in Leora wasn't something you could drill into someone. It was something she had pulled from herself like a blade from a sheath, sharp and ready the moment it was called for. And that unsettled him because it wasn't something he could control. They reached a clearing, the moonlight spilling silver across the ground, and Reeves signaled for a temporary halt. The wounded needed fresh bandaging before they pushed the last mile. Leora lowered her patient gently, her hands already working with mechanical precision, cleaning, dressing, sealing, her movements efficient and calm. But when the sound of movement crackled in the distance, the rustle of branches, the crunch of boots, their reprieve evaporated instantly. Reeves froze, raising a fist to silence his men. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. And then from the shadows, came the unmistakable sound of foreign voices, low and sharp, growing closer. The enemy had fanned out, hunting for survivors, and they were closing in fast. The SEALs melted into defensive positions, rifles leveled, eyes narrowed through night vision optics. Reeves gestured for silence, ready to let the enemy patrol pass, but fate wasn't kind. A stray beam of flashlight swept across the clearing, freezing on the bandage Leora had left behind in haste, blood glistening faintly against the leaves. The shouts that followed shattered the fragile silence, and gunfire erupted like a storm. Bullets chewed into bark and earth, sparks flaring as rounds skipped against stone. Reeves barked orders, his men answering with precise, disciplined volleys. The forest became a battlefield, shadows alive with muzzle flashes, the air alive with death. And once again, Leora found herself caught between identities, healer and marksman, her instincts dragging her in both directions at once. She shoved her patient flat, pressing his head down to shield him, before pulling her rifle up in a single fluid motion. There was no hesitation now. She moved with terrifying clarity, her eyes locking onto the shifting silhouettes in the trees, her fingers squeezing the trigger with ruthless precision. Each shot she fired wasn't wild panic. It was deliberate, exact, cutting down threats before they could advance. A soldier lunged from the brush, weapon raised, but Leora's round caught him mid-stride, snapping him back into the darkness. Another tried flanking low, crawling through the undergrowth, but she saw the subtle twitch of foliage and placed a round directly into the shadow that betrayed him. The SEAL nearest to her, hardened by years of combat, stole a glance at her between bursts of fire, and for the first time, he felt something close to awe. She wasn't supposed to fight like this. She wasn't supposed to fight at all. And yet, she was holding the line as though she'd been born to it. The battle raged for minutes that felt like hours. Branches splintered, leaves fell like rain, and the cries of the wounded punctuated the night. Reeves moved like a predator, orchestrating his men with brutal efficiency, but even he couldn't deny the shift in his formation. Leora wasn't simply patching wounds or dragging the injured to cover, she was reshaping the fight itself, her rifle a force multiplier that tipped the scales. And when the last enemy soldier fell, silence returning in a slow, suffocating wave, Reeves stood there in the aftermath, chest heaving, staring at her through the settling smoke. She knelt beside her patient again, hands already red with blood, as though nothing had changed, as though she hadn't just killed half a dozen men with clinical precision. It was the dissonance that unsettled him most. She shifted from healer to marksman as easily as one might change stances, and she seemed untouched by the weight of it. When the SEALs regrouped, their eyes lingered on her longer than before. They said nothing, but she felt their stares pressing against her like a second skin. She wanted to believe it was suspicion, maybe even fear, but beneath it there was something else, something dangerous. Respect. Not the kind that came from rank or time served, but the kind that came from proving yourself in fire. And that terrified her more than anything. She didn't want their respect. She didn't want to be seen as one of them because deep down she knew what that meant. Once you start pulling the trigger, once you start shaping death with your own hands, you can never go back to being just a healer. And yet, here she was, walking that line, unable to retreat from what she had done. The trek to the extraction point was silent, but the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive, thick with the unspoken. Leora felt it with every step. She replayed the shots in her head, not with pride, not even with guilt, but with a strange clarity she couldn't shake. She had been precise. She had been necessary. And that frightened her more than any battlefield wound she had ever treated. When the helicopter's rotors finally thundered in the distance, whipping the trees with violent wind, she felt no relief. The night had etched something into her that wouldn't fade with dust-off or debrief. She had crossed the threshold, and she knew, with an ache deep in her bones, that the SEALs would never look at her the same way again. And maybe Just maybe she wouldn't look at herself the same way either. The helicopter thundered through the night sky, its cabin vibrating with the raw mechanical growl of rotors pushing against gravity. The SEALs sat in silence, helmets tilted forward, their gear heavy with dust and blood. The only voice was the intermittent hiss of the radio crackling updates to base. Leora sat near the rear, her patient's head resting against her lap, her gloved hands steady on the bandages she had layered over his wound. The red light of the cabin cast everything in shades of shadow and crimson, making the scene look more like a painting of war than reality. She kept her eyes down, avoiding the glances she knew were being thrown her way. Every man on that bird had seen her fire with lethal precision, and though no one spoke, she could feel their judgment like the weight of a rifle barrel pressing against her temple. They weren't questioning her ability. They were questioning what she had become. Commander Reeves sat opposite her, strapped in tight, his expression unreadable. His mind was a battlefield of its own. He replayed the mission in fragments. The gunfire, the explosion, the clarity of her command in the yard, the accuracy of her shots in the forest. He had led dozens of medics in his career. They were essential, dependable, life-saving. But Leora, she wasn't just a medic anymore. He had seen her do something even his most seasoned snipers couldn't replicate under such pressure. And she had done it without hesitation. That kind of instinct didn't come from training manuals or drills. It came from somewhere primal, somewhere dangerous. He wanted to pull her aside, demand answers, but he knew this wasn't the time. The men needed rest. The wounded needed treatment. The mission was barely over. And yet, as the helicopter pitched toward the horizon, Reeves knew this wasn't finished. He couldn't shake the thought, was she still their healer, or had she become something else entirely? When they landed at the forward operating base, dawn was bleeding across the desert sky, painting the world in muted oranges and grays. Dust swirled around the helicopter as the men disembarked, carrying the wounded with practiced urgency. Leora stayed with her patient all the way to the infirmary, refusing to relinquish him until the doctors pulled her back with firm hands. Only then did she step aside, peeling off her gloves, her fingers stiff and trembling as though they no longer belonged to her. She stared at them for a long moment, these hands that had stitched torn flesh, soothed fevered brows, pressed against wounds to preserve life. Tonight, those same hands had squeezed a trigger again and again, sending men to their deaths. She couldn't reconcile the two images, but she couldn't deny them either. The hands of a healer. The hands of a killer. Both were hers now. Later, in the dim quiet of the debriefing room, Reeves stood at the head of the table, his men seated in silence. Their after-action report was straightforward. Objectives secured, weapons caches destroyed, enemy neutralized, one casualty stable. On paper it was a success. But the air in the room was heavy with the unspoken. Reeves let the silence stretch, watching his men carefully. He could see it in their eyes, the way they flicked toward Leora and then away, uncertain, conflicted. Finally, Reeves broke the silence. "We all saw what happened out there," he said, his voice steady but edged with steel. "We don't ignore it. We don't bury it. We acknowledge it." His gaze shifted directly to Leora. "Our medic stepped up when the fight demanded it. She took shots no one else could, and because of that, we're all sitting here instead of zipped in body bags. That's the truth." His words were firm, but they didn't erase the tension. Respect was there, yes, but respect can cut both ways, edged with admiration on one side and fear on the other. Leora sat still, her shoulders squared but her mind unraveling. She wanted to speak, to insist that what she had done wasn't who she was, but the words wouldn't form. Because deep down, part of her knew it was exactly who she was now. Silence became her refuge, but silence was dangerous too. It let their imaginations fill the void. Reeves dismissed the men eventually, but before they filed out, one of the younger SEALs lingered near her. His eyes held a mixture of gratitude and unease. "Doc," he muttered, using the nickname they all gave her, "I don't know what the hell you are anymore, but I'm glad you were with us." Then he left, leaving her with a single truth: she couldn't return to who she had been before. Not in their eyes. Not in her own. The days that followed were restless. Leora buried herself in routine, treating sprains, stitching cuts, checking vitals, but everything felt different. Every time she reached for her kit, she felt the phantom weight of her rifle on her back. Every time she touched a wound, she remembered the recoil against her shoulder, the way her breath had steadied before each shot. At night, sleep eluded her. When it came, it brought dreams, not of blood or screams but of silence, of perfect clarity, of seeing targets through a sight and knowing she could end them with a single squeeze. It wasn't horror she felt in those dreams. It was control. And that was what frightened her most. Healing had always been about fighting against chaos, stitching order back into broken bodies. But pulling the trigger, that was the purest order she had ever felt. A straight line from cause to effect. A decision absolute. And it called to her like nothing else ever had. Reeves noticed the change. He was a man who read people the way others read maps, and Leora was no exception. He saw the way she lingered on the rifle racks longer than before, the way her posture had shifted, straighter, sharper, as though she had been reborn in combat. He pulled her aside one evening, the desert sun casting long shadows across the base. "You need to talk about it," he said quietly, his tone stripped of command, carrying only the weight of concern. "You can't carry this alone." Leora looked at him, her eyes steady but hollow. "I'm not carrying it," she said softly. "It's carrying me." Reeves didn't like that answer. He didn't like it at all. Because it wasn't guilt in her voice, it was something else. Something dangerous. She wasn't haunted by what she had done. She was becoming it. Word spread quietly through the unit. Stories had a way of twisting, growing larger than the truth. Some said she had dropped an enemy sniper at 500 yards with one shot. Others whispered she had moved like a ghost through the trees, cutting down a dozen men on her own. The reality was enough, but myths always traveled faster than facts. Soon, even those who hadn't been on the mission were looking at her differently. Respect. Fear. Curiosity. The lines blurred. And in the midst of it all, Leora felt the walls closing in. She hadn't chosen this path. Or maybe she had, in the instant her fingers squeezed that trigger. Either way, there was no turning back. The SEALs would call it unforgettable, a night etched into their legacy. But for Leora it was something far more intimate. It was the night she stopped being only a healer, and began becoming something she didn't yet have a name for. The desert night was alive with the hum of distant generators and the muted chatter of soldiers, but inside Leora's quarters silence reigned. She sat at the edge of her bunk, the glow from a single lamp throwing shadows across the room. Her hands rested on her knees, palms up, fingers curled slightly inward as though she were weighing something invisible. She had patched men up all day, worked with the same calm efficiency as always, but when she closed her eyes she didn't see bandages or sutures. She saw crosshairs. She saw the blur of silhouettes in the forest, the way they had dropped, one after another, when her trigger pulled. She told herself she should feel shame or guilt, but instead she felt clarity, an unsettling, addictive clarity. The healer inside her should have been horrified. But the part of her that had emerged in combat whispered that she had finally found balance. And she didn't know which voice to trust anymore. Reeves watched her from a distance in those days. He wasn't a man prone to sentiment, but Leora had become something he couldn't categorize, and that gnawed at him. His men were instruments, some blunt, some sharp, but all designed for one purpose: execution of mission. Medics were different. They were the lifelines, the anchors that reminded the team of the value of survival amidst death. But Leora had blurred the line, bending her role into something new. He'd seen operators snap under pressure before, but what he saw in her wasn't snapping. It was hardening. Becoming. And though it had saved them once, Reeves knew that unchecked transformations had consequences. He had to test her, see whether this was a spark that would burn out or a flame that would consume everything in its path. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. A hidden encampment dug deep into the mountains, housing not only weapons but also prisoners, civilians and allies who had been snatched and used as leverage. The mission wasn't just seek and destroy, it was extraction. And extraction missions demanded precision, restraint, and often a medic's steady hands. Reeves knew Leora was essential, but he also knew the battlefield might tempt the other side of her, the side that had surfaced in the compound and forest. As the briefing concluded, Reeves's eyes locked with hers across the table. She didn't flinch. If anything, she looked as though she had been waiting for this. That unsettled him more than anything. The team deployed under cover of night, scaling the jagged ridges of the mountains with their gear biting into their shoulders. The air was thin, sharp, every breath a reminder of altitude. They moved like wraiths, each step calculated, every sound swallowed by the wind. Leora was near the rear, her rifle strapped snugly, her pack balanced perfectly. She moved smoother than she once had, more sure-footed, less like a medic carrying equipment and more like an operator carrying intent. Reeves noticed. Everyone did. The silence of their approach amplified it. This wasn't the same woman who had once stayed glued to the wounded, whispering reassurances while others fought. This was someone evolving, someone whose presence in the formation no longer felt like a liability, but a threat, depending on how it unfolded. They reached the outskirts of the encampment just before dawn. Smoke curled from fires inside the perimeter, silhouettes of armed men pacing the crude barricades. Reeves spread the team across vantage points, laying down the plan in whispers. 2 teams would breach opposite sides, neutralize resistance, secure prisoners, and extract before reinforcements could close the distance. Leora's role was clear: stabilize the hostages, treat injuries, prepare them for transport. But even as Reeves laid out the assignments, he caught the faintest flicker in her eyes, a hunger subtle but undeniable when she glanced at the guards on the walls. He didn't call it out. Not yet. But the warning pulsed in the back of his mind: watch her. The breach unfolded with violent precision. Suppressed fire cut down sentries, and the SEALs slipped into the camp like knives through cloth. Chaos spread quickly, men shouting, scrambling, weapons raised too late. Reeves's voice crackled through comms, directing movements like a conductor shaping music from violence. Leora pushed with the second wave, slipping into the main hut where prisoners were huddled under dim lanterns. The sight clawed at her heart: civilians bound, bruised, their eyes wide with a mix of terror and fragile hope. Her medic's instinct surged, and she dropped to her knees immediately, cutting restraints, whispering steady reassurances. Her hands moved fast, checking pulses, applying tourniquets, treating burns. For a moment, the healer reigned. For a moment, she remembered exactly why she had chosen this path in the first place. But then the gunfire outside intensified, closer, sharper, punctuated by shouts in the enemy's dialect. Reeves's warning voice cut through the comms: more inbound. They're circling from the ridge. Leora froze, her hand still pressed against a prisoner's arm. Through the thin wooden wall, she heard boots pounding closer, voices rising. She glanced at the door. The healer inside her whispered, "Stay, protect them, tend to them." But the marksman roared louder, "Stop the threat before it reaches them." Her body moved before her conscience could decide. She grabbed her rifle, rising to the doorway in a smooth, silent motion, her eyes narrowing into the half-light of dawn. Shapes emerged at the edge of the camp, half a dozen armed men advancing fast. She exhaled, the world narrowing to a tunnel. And then she fired. The first shot punched through a man's skull, dropping him instantly. The second cut another down before he could lift his weapon. The third, the fourth, the fifth, each shot perfect, each body collapsing into the dirt. The prisoners behind her gasped, some shielding their eyes, others staring in stunned silence. To them, she was no longer just the medic who had freed their hands, she was the executioner standing guard at the threshold of their survival. Reeves's voice crackled in her ear, sharp but steady. "Doc, status?" She hesitated for only a fraction before answering. "Clear," she said. Her tone was calm, level, as though ending lives had become just another line in her duties. The fight raged on the far side of the camp, but the momentum had shifted. With the guards outside eliminated, the SEALs tightened their grip, cutting through resistance until the last echoes of gunfire faded. The prisoners were herded quickly toward the exfil route, Leora moving among them with equal parts healer and sentinel. She kept her rifle raised, scanning ridges, while her hands steadied the injured and her voice urged them onward. Reeves saw it all as they regrouped. He saw how seamlessly she moved between identities, how fluidly she transitioned from stitching wounds to creating them. It wasn't forced. It wasn't conflicted. It was natural. And that chilled him to his core. He had fought beside men who gloried in the kill, who craved the clarity of violence, but Leora was different. She didn't glory. She didn't crave. She simply did. Without hesitation. Without remorse. When the team finally reached the extraction zone, the helicopter blades whipping the mountain air into a frenzy, Reeves caught her arm before she could climb aboard. His grip was firm, his eyes locked onto hers. "What are you becoming?" he demanded, his voice low but fierce, swallowed by the roar of the rotors. For the first time, Leora didn't avert her gaze. She met his stare with an intensity that nearly matched his. "I'm becoming what you need me to be," she said simply. Reeves let her go, but the words stayed with him, gnawing deeper with every passing second. Because he knew, in the pit of his gut, that what she was becoming wasn't something anyone could control, not even her. The return flight from the mountains was a blur of noise and silence stitched together, the helicopter blades pounding against the thin air, the rescued prisoners huddled close, their faces etched with gratitude and terror. Leora sat among them, her hands working tirelessly to bind wounds and stop bleeding, her voice steady as she whispered promises they needed to hear. To them she was salvation, gentle, focused, protective. But every so often, when their eyes darted to the rifle still slung across her chest, they flinched. They had seen her fire it. They had seen her step into the doorway of their prison and turn advancing soldiers into corpses with surgical precision. They didn't know whether to see her as a healer or as something else. And the truth was, neither did she. Reeves sat across from her, his gaze unrelenting. He didn't speak a word during the flight, but his silence was louder than any accusation. His mind replayed her response at the extraction zone, "I'm becoming what you need me to be." It was a soldier's answer, a killer's answer, not the kind he expected from a medic. Yet it hadn't been defiance in her voice. It had been calm acceptance, as though she had made peace with something most men wrestled against their entire careers. Reeves respected control, but what he saw in her wasn't control. It was surrender to an instinct that no longer distinguished between saving lives and ending them. He knew the men were whispering about her already, trading stories of her precision, her calm under fire. And Reeves knew that kind of myth, once born, never died. It either consumed or corrupted. Back at base, the debrief was clinical as always. Reeves delivered the facts, the team filled in their accounts, and the success of the mission was logged into the endless archive of classified victories. But the air in the room was different. When the talk turned to casualties and kill counts, a few eyes flicked toward Leora, subtle but undeniable. She kept her face still, her breathing even, but inside she felt the weight of their stares like sand pressing into a wound. They weren't blaming her. That was what made it worse. They were measuring her, recalibrating how they saw her, rewriting her role in their minds. She was no longer just document. She was something more, something they hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Reeves ended the session briskly, his voice clipped. But when the men filed out, none looked at her quite the same. That night, sleep evaded her again. She walked the perimeter of the base alone, the desert stretching endless and silent under the pale glow of the moon. The sand shifted beneath her boots, the air sharp in her lungs, but her thoughts drowned out everything else. She tried to tell herself she was still who she had always been, the girl who had gone into medicine because she couldn't stand to see suffering, who had sworn to preserve life at any cost. But the images in her mind betrayed her. The clarity of the scope, the stillness before the shot, the absolute certainty of ending a threat, it lingered with a seductive simplicity. Healing was chaos, messy, uncertain, a gamble between life and death. Killing was order. Precise. Final. She didn't want to admit which one felt more natural now. And that terrified her more than the enemy ever could. The following days revealed the cracks in the team. They didn't avoid her, SEALs weren't cowards, but they treated her differently. Conversations quieted when she entered the room. Jokes that once included her now skirted around her presence. They still respected her, but respect had morphed into distance, edged with unease. Only one of them, a broad-shouldered veteran named Kane, dared voice it aloud. One evening, while cleaning his rifle, he glanced at her and said, "You know, Doc, some of the boys don't know whether to thank you or keep their distance. Not every day the medic turns out to be a better shot than half the snipers." His tone wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was matter-of-fact, like an observation written into a logbook. Leora didn't reply. She just kept her hands busy, checking her supplies, pretending the comment hadn't pierced deeper than a bullet. Reeves, however, wasn't content to let things fester. He called her into his quarters late one night, the room dim except for a single lamp over his desk. His uniform was stripped down to fatigues, his posture relaxed but his eyes razor-sharp. "Sit," he ordered. She obeyed without a word. For a long moment he studied her, the silence stretching taut. Finally he leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "I've seen operators lose themselves out there," he said. "Seen them start thinking the trigger is the answer to everything. Most of them don't come back from that. They stop seeing people. Start seeing targets. You know what happens then?" Leora met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "They stop being useful," she said quietly. Reeves's jaw tightened. "They stop being human." Her words, calm and measured, unnerved him more than if she had shouted in denial. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't blind. She knew exactly what she was saying. And maybe, just maybe, she had already accepted it. But fate doesn't pause for internal wars. A week later, new orders came down. Another mission, this one more dangerous than the last. Intelligence suggested a convoy of high-value targets moving across the desert, guarded by an armed escort. The objective was interception and capture, not annihilation. That meant precision. That meant restraint. Reeves felt a cold unease twist in his gut. He knew Leora's trigger discipline had been flawless so far, but this mission wasn't about killing. It was about control. And control was exactly what he feared she was losing, even if she didn't realize it herself. He considered pulling her from the roster, but the higher-ups demanded a medic on every op, and after her last missions, no one else carried her credibility. He was trapped. They all were. The night of the mission, the desert wind howled like a living thing, sand whipping against goggles and skin. The convoy moved across the flats in a line of dust and headlights, armored trucks bristling with weapons. Reeves positioned his team in the dunes, eyes fixed through scopes, voices low and tense over comms. Non-lethal if possible, Reeves reminded them. Take out engines, drivers if you have to. No stray fire. The men acknowledged. Leora lay prone among them, her rifle balanced perfectly, her breath. Even. Through her scope, she watched the convoy roll closer, each vehicle a beast of steel and dust. She heard Reeves's words. She understood them. But the longer she stared, the quieter the healer's voice became. She didn't just see vehicles. She saw patterns, vulnerabilities, targets. And in her chest, that same clarity hummed, steady and insistent. When the first shot rang out, it wasn't hers, it was Kane's, shredding a tire, sending sparks across the sand. The convoy shuddered, men spilling from the backs of trucks, gunfire erupting into the night. Reeves barked orders, the SEALs returning fire in disciplined bursts. And Leora felt the world narrow again, her scope painting lines of inevitability across the chaos. Her finger hovered over the trigger, her pulse slowing, her breath calm. The healer begged her to hold back. The marksman whispered that hesitation killed. And in the storm of sand and bullets, Leora had to decide which voice she belonged to. The desert exploded in chaos. Gunfire cracked like thunder across the dunes, headlights cut jagged beams through the whirling sand, and the convoy staggered as tires shredded and engines sputtered under the SEALs' precision fire. Men shouted in a dozen voices, scrambling from the trucks, spraying bullets wildly into the night. Reeves barked orders through comms, his tone sharp, clipped, commanding. Engines first. Drivers next. Do not waste shots. Repeat, non-lethal unless forced. His men obeyed with the mechanical discipline of years, but discipline was fragile in the heat of battle, and chaos pressed against it like a tide. And in the middle of it, prone in the sand with her rifle steady, was Leora. Through her scope, the world became stripped of noise and fury. The wind, the bullets, the shouts, they blurred into nothing. What remained were clean lines, silhouettes moving against headlights, patterns of motion that revealed intent before it was acted. A man leaning out from the truck bed, his barrel rising toward Kane. Leora's crosshairs kissed his temple. One squeeze and he would never fire. Her finger twitched, but she held. Reeves's order echoed in her skull, non-lethal unless forced. The healer in her clung to it. But the marksman whispered louder. Hesitation was a gamble, hesitation cost lives. The decision was stolen from her when the man's muzzle flashed. Kane ducked, cursing, sand spraying into his eyes. Leora fired. The soldier's skull snapped back in a violent arc, his body tumbling lifelessly from the vehicle. The shot was perfect. Necessary. But as his corpse hit the sand, Leora felt nothing. No guilt, no triumph. Only that same terrifying clarity, as if her heart beat not to keep her alive, but to keep her aim steady. Reeves caught the kill through his scope. His gut twisted, but he said nothing. He knew the shot had saved Kane. He knew it had been justified. But what unsettled him wasn't the act, it was the way she moved after it. Seamlessly. Without pause, without visible weight. Like it was who she had always been. He couldn't deny she was saving them again, but he also couldn't shake the truth gnawing at his chest. She was slipping further from the healer he had known, deeper into something else. The fight escalated. An engine roared as a driver tried to punch through the kill zone, sand spraying from spinning tires. Reeves ordered suppression fire, but the truck barreled forward, a machine gunner braced on the roof. Leora pivoted, her rifle following the driver's profile. Reeves's voice snarled over comms. Disable. Non-lethal. But in her scope, the driver's head was the clearest, cleanest target. She forced her aim lower, exhaling as she squeezed. The shot tore through the engine block, sparks erupting as the truck shuddered to a halt. The gunner sprayed wild arcs overhead before Reeves cut him down. The truck went still. Reeves's chest loosened, though his mind was still a storm. She had obeyed, but by a razor's edge. Minutes stretched like hours until the last hostile fell. Smoke from burning engines mixed with the biting desert sand, the air alive with heat and death. The convoy was crippled, its escorts scattered and silent. The SEALs moved fast, weapons sweeping, voices sharp as they secured survivors. Reeves ordered the prisoners dragged from the vehicles, Blindfolded men of rank, their faces twisted with shock and fury. It was a clean win. On paper, perfect. But Reeves's eyes weren't on the mission anymore. They were on Leora. She moved through the aftermath like she belonged to it, her rifle slung casually as though it were an extension of her body. But at the same time she bent over wounded prisoners, checking pulses, treating burns from exploding engines, binding bleeding cuts. She was both things at once, gentle, precise, ruthless. Reeves saw the contradiction and it chilled him. She wasn't struggling between healer and marksman anymore. She was merging them. Becoming both, seamlessly, as though she had found no conflict in carrying life in one hand and death in the other. The team loaded prisoners and gear for extraction, but Reeves pulled Leora aside before boarding. The desert wind whipped at their faces, carrying grit against their skin. His voice was low, sharp. You saved Kane tonight. You disabled that truck. You held to the rules. He paused, eyes narrowing. But I saw you. I saw how close you were to ignoring me. Leora met his stare, her expression calm, almost cold. Clothes doesn't matter, she said. I followed your orders. Reeves clenched his jaw. It's not about the order. It's about what you wanted to do. And I think you wanted the kill. Her silence was answer enough. Back at base the tension grew thicker. Kane clapped her on the shoulder with a grateful nod, muttering, You saved my ass out there. Others gave her the same glances as before, half respect, half fear. Rumors spread quicker now. Stories of how she had dropped men in the forest, how she had crippled the convoy with surgical shots. Some claimed she was better than their best shooters, others whispered that she was dangerous to have beside them. Reeves heard it all, and though he shut down the talk publicly, privately he knew it was spiraling. The myth of Leora was growing faster than he could control, and myths had consequences. Meanwhile, Leora drifted further from herself. At night, she cleaned her rifle with the same tenderness she once reserved for her medical kit. Her dreams were sharper now, no longer fragmented images but clear, vivid moments where she stood in the blur of battle, steady, precise, unstoppable. She woke with her pulse calm, not racing. As though her body didn't fear what she was becoming, it embraced it. Reeves confronted her again days later, in the training yard where she had been practicing alone. Her shots punched through targets with unerring accuracy, each one center mass, each one timed with perfect breath control. Reeves stood behind her, arms folded, his voice hard. You're not a sniper, he said. She lowered the rifle slowly, turning toward him. Maybe I'm both, she replied. That's the problem, Reeves shot back. You can't be both. A medic's job is to preserve. A sniper's job is to eliminate. One can't live with the other. They'll eat each other alive. Leora tilted her head slightly, her eyes unreadable. Or maybe they balance each other. Maybe that's why I can do what I do. Because I know what life costs, I know what death means. And I choose which one matters in the moment. Her words cut deeper than bullets. Reeves didn't answer. He had no answer. Because part of him, buried under layers of command and discipline, feared she was right. The next mission orders arrived before their argument could continue. High-value extraction again, but this time in a city scarred by war, where civilians filled the streets and enemies hid among them. The risk of collateral damage was high, the margin for error razor-thin. Reeves stared at the orders, then at Leora. She stared back, calm, waiting. He knew this would be the breaking point. Not for the mission. For her. For all of them. And as he dismissed the men to prepare, only one thought circled in his mind. If she chose the marksman completely this time, would she ever come back? The city smelled of smoke and dust, 1,000 buildings crumbling under years of war, their walls pocked with bullet holes and fire scars. Narrow streets twisted like veins, choked with debris and shadows, while the silence between distant gunshots carried a tension heavier than any battlefield. For Reeves and his SEALs, cities were nightmares, unpredictable, filled with eyes watching from windows, alleys hiding threats that could strike in seconds. But for Leora the city pulsed differently. She saw not only the dangers but also the fragile traces of life among the ruins. Women pulling children close when the soldiers passed, old men sweeping shattered glass from doorways, young boys carrying water jugs through rubble. She felt the healer in her stir, reaching instinctively for these fragments of survival. And yet, as her rifle hung at her side, the marksman inside whispered its readiness, a predator waiting in the dark. Their mission was clear. Extract an informant who had been feeding intelligence on enemy weapons caches. He was cornered deep within the district, guarded by a network of armed loyalists who blended seamlessly into the civilian crowd. The SEALs needed to go in fast, precise, invisible if possible. Collateral damage was not just unacceptable, it would turn the population against them instantly. Reeves gathered the team in a bombed-out apartment before insertion. Maps spread across a cracked table, the smell of mold and ash thick in the air. "We move silent," he said, his voice sharp. "No stray shots, no heavy fire. Civilians everywhere. This isn't a battlefield, it's a minefield. One mistake and we lose more than the mission." His eyes landed on Leora harder than on anyone else. She didn't flinch under the weight of his stare. She only nodded once. Understood. They moved at night, shadows slipping through streets that still glowed faintly from distant fires. The team flowed like water, hugging walls, sweeping alleys, their boots silent on broken stone. Leora carried her rifle low, every sense heightened. She saw faces in the windows, fear, suspicion, resignation. Children peeked from doorways, their eyes too old for their bodies. She wanted to reach for them, to say something, to prove she wasn't like the other soldiers who passed through their streets. But the mission pressed forward, demanding silence. And the marksman inside reminded her, distractions got people killed. The first contact came in the form of shadows moving at the far end of an alley. Armed men, rifles slung carelessly, confident in the streets they knew better than anyone. Reeves signaled the halt. The SEALs crouched low, weapons raised, breath slow. Leora felt the urge rise like a tide. Through her scope, she had the first man's chest squarely in her sights. One pull and the alley would be one threat lighter. But Reeves raised his hand, cutting through her focus. He pointed 2 fingers, then waved them toward a crumbling stairwell. The team slipped up, bypassing the patrol unseen. The men passed below, oblivious. Leora's pulse slowed. It was the right call. The healer agreed. The marksman sulked. Deeper in, the streets grew narrower, bodies closer, tension sharper. The informant's hideout was in a half-collapsed shop, its doorway covered by scavenged cloth. But it was surrounded, men with rifles posted at corners, their eyes sweeping, their fingers restless. Reeves cursed under his breath. It was tighter than intel suggested. They needed a distraction. Kane whispered an idea about explosives, but Reeves shot it down instantly. Too loud. Too dangerous. Then his eyes shifted to Leora. For the first time, he hesitated before giving her an order. "You're our ghost," he said quietly. "Silent shots. No alarms. Drop the guards quick and clean. We'll breach as soon as you clear the way." She froze for a fraction of a second. The healer screamed in protest. "No, not here, not in the middle of a civilian quarter." But the marksman surged with elation. Finally, no hesitation, no restraint. Just the rifle, just the clarity. She nodded, lying prone against the broken stone, the scope rising to her eye. Breath in. Hold. The first guard's head filled her crosshairs. Breath out. Trigger squeeze. He dropped without a sound, his rifle clattering softly. She shifted instantly, second guard, third. One by one they fell like chess pieces tipped by invisible hands. The SEALs watched in silence, their jaws tight, their respect unwilling but undeniable. Reeves's heart pounded. He hated how smooth it was. He hated how she made it look like art. But he gave the signal and the team moved. The breach was swift. Reeves and Kane slammed through the cloth doorway, rifles raised, shouting commands. Inside, 2 more guards scrambled for weapons but dropped fast under controlled fire. The informant cowered in the corner, a frail man with haunted eyes. Leora swept in after them, her rifle still warm, her breath unnervingly calm. She scanned the room, then knelt by the man, her hands shifting instantly from soldier to medic. She checked his pulse, his breathing, his eyes, reassuring him with a calm tone that cut through his panic. The healer was alive in her hands, soothing, saving. The SEALs moved to secure the building, but Reeves stayed in the doorway watching. Watching the paradox in front of him. Minutes ago, she was a ghost reaping silently from the shadows. Now she was salvation, tender and steady. The extraction should have ended cleanly. But fate has a way of punishing clarity. As they moved back through the streets with the informant in tow, a cry erupted. A young boy, no more than 10, running from an alley toward them, his hands clutching something. Reeves's blood turned cold. The shape was unmistakable. A grenade, pin already pulled. The SEALs shouted, rifles snapping toward the child. In that frozen heartbeat, time split. The marksman and Leora screamed at her, "Shoot." 1 bullet, 1 child, 1 grenade neutralized. The healer screamed louder. No. This was no soldier, no enemy. This was innocence corrupted by war. Killing him would be survival, but it would be unforgivable. Her finger hovered on the trigger. The scope locked on the boy's chest. Her breath slowed, perfect. But her heart raced, shattering the calm. She saw Kane swinging his rifle. She saw Reeves yelling, torn between choices. And she saw the boy's terrified eyes, wide and wet, carrying more fear than malice. The grenade slipped in his tiny hands. Leora moved. Not the way Reeves expected. Not the way the marksman demanded. She lunged forward, breaking cover, sprinting straight at the child. The world narrowed into gasps and shouts, bullets whipping past her as enemies stirred at the commotion. She reached him in 2 strides, her arms slamming around his small body. With one motion, she ripped the grenade from his hands, hurled it down the alley. It exploded in a roar of fire and stone, the shockwave knocking them both to the ground. Her body shielded his as debris rained down. Silence followed, broken only by ringing ears and the pounding of hearts. The boy sobbed beneath her, alive. Shaken, terrified, but alive. The SEALs stared, their rifles still raised, their breaths caught. Reeves rushed forward, grabbing her by the vest, dragging her to her feet. His eyes blazed with fury and relief all at once. "What the hell was that?" he barked. But his voice cracked. He had seen what she had chosen. And though it defied logic, it had saved them all from becoming monsters in that moment. Leora didn't answer. Her arms trembled as she held the boy, her hands still steady, her breath still calm. She looked at Reeves with eyes that held both fire and ice. "I am both," she whispered. "And I will never let you forget it." The boy's cries still echoed in Reeves's ears as the SEALs pulled back through the city, every step heavy with what had just unfolded. The informant stumbled along between Kane and another man, half terrified of the soldiers escorting him, half grateful he was still breathing. Civilians peeked from shattered windows and alleys, eyes wide with disbelief. They hadn't just seen foreign soldiers storm through their streets. They had seen one of them, the woman who carried a rifle like death itself, throw herself over a child to save him. Whispers rippled through the ruins, whispers that would become stories, stories that would outlast the mission itself. And Leora knew it. She could feel the weight of their stares pressing into her back as she walked, the boy's small sobs muffled against her vest. For the first time since the forest, since that first impossible shot, she wondered if the healer inside her hadn't been lost after all. But Reeves's expression was dark, storming behind his eyes. He marched ahead, jaw tight, scanning rooftops as much to avoid her gaze as to watch for threats. He couldn't reconcile what had happened. She had broken formation, ignored orders, risked everything. In his book, such a move could have gotten them all killed. Yet it hadn't. It had saved them, saved not just the team but their souls. The men hadn't fired on the child. They hadn't stained themselves in that unforgivable way. Reeves hated it, but he knew the truth. She had chosen the one path none of them could. And that choice would haunt him because it proved what he had feared all along. She wasn't one of them anymore. She was something else. They reached the extraction point at dawn, where a chopper waited, blades thundering against the pink horizon. The team bundled the informant aboard, Kane signaling all clear. Reeves hung back, watching Leora as she finally let go of the boy. She knelt low, speaking softly in words the child barely understood, her hands brushing dust from his face. He clung to her for a moment, unwilling to release, until she gently pressed him toward an older woman rushing out of the ruins to claim him. The healer glowed in her eyes then, as strong and fierce as the marksman's precision had been hours earlier. Reeves swallowed hard. He wanted to shout at her, curse her, demand she explain herself. But the boy's tears silenced him. He turned away, climbing into the bird, leaving her words unsaid. The flight back to base was quiet, heavy. The SEALs avoided speaking, their thoughts too tangled to share. Kane sat across from Leora, his eyes studying her like she was a puzzle too dangerous to solve. At last he muttered, "You could have been killed. We could have been killed." She looked at him, calm as stone. "Or we could have lived with something worse than death." He didn't argue, but he didn't nod either. Reeves overheard and clenched his fists tighter. Back at base, debrief was a storm. Command wanted every detail, every choice explained. Reeves gave the facts straight, professional. Extraction successful, informant secure, minimal casualties, no collateral damage. On paper it was a clean mission. But when command pressed about the civilian child, his voice faltered. He explained what Leora had done, how she'd acted against orders but prevented a bloodstain that would have poisoned the mission beyond repair. Silence followed on the other end. Finally, command's cold response came, unorthodox. But results stand. Reeves wanted to scream. To him it wasn't that simple. She had crossed lines, blurred them, broken them. And yet, she had won. That night, Reeves found her alone by the armory, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her rifle taken apart in pieces before her. She cleaned it with slow, careful motions, but her gaze was far away, lost in thought. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping in, his boots echoing against concrete. "You disobeyed me," he said. No anger in his tone, just steel. She didn't look up. "I saved him." "That's not the point," Reeves shot back. "Orders exist for a reason. If every soldier followed their heart instead of command, we'd drown in chaos." She finally raised her eyes, locking onto his. "Maybe chaos is better than losing what makes us human." Her words struck deep, deeper than he wanted to admit. Reeves stepped closer, his voice low, trembling despite himself. "You don't understand. I can't lead men who hesitate, who question, who—" She cut him off, her voice calm, sharp as a blade. "I didn't hesitate. That's why he's alive. That's why you didn't have to carry his blood on your hands. And that's why you'll remember me, Reeves. Because I did what none of you could." The silence between them was heavy, stretching long, filled with truth neither wanted to face. Reeves finally exhaled, shoulders sagging. "You're not a medic anymore," he said softly. "And you're not one of my snipers. You're something else. And I don't know if that terrifies me or saves me." Leora slid the bolt of her rifle into place with a click, her hand steady. "Maybe both." Days passed. The informant's intel led to strikes that crippled enemy operations, victories chalked up to the mission they had pulled off. Around base, whispers of Leora grew louder. Some called her reckless, others a miracle. Some feared her, others revered her. To the civilians in that broken city, she became a ghost story savior, the woman who carried death in her hands but chose life when it mattered. To the SEALs, she became unforgettable for reasons they couldn't put into words. Reeves watched it all unfold, his own thoughts spiraling. He wanted to ground her, to rein her in, but he couldn't. She had stepped beyond the lines he lived by, into something untouchable. On their final night together, before deployment shifts separated the unit, Reeves found her once more, sitting beneath the desert stars outside the wire. He sat beside her, both of them silent for a while, the night wind cool against their faces. At last he spoke. "You've changed us. Whether you meant to or not." She didn't answer, only kept her gaze on the stars. After a long pause, she murmured, "I was a healer. I still am. But I learned something out there. Healing isn't just about bandages and medicine. Sometimes it's about stopping the hurt before it happens. Even if that means pulling the trigger." Reeves nodded slowly, the truth sinking into him like a stone in water. He knew then what the others would never say out loud. She had become something beyond their training, beyond their orders. She was the contradiction they couldn't reconcile, healer and marksman, life and death in one body. And though it unsettled him, he also knew this. He would never forget it. None of them would. When dawn came, the team dispersed to new assignments, new missions. The war would grind on as wars always did. But the legend of that night in the city, the night she saved a boy with her bare hands instead of her trigger finger, spread like wildfire. To civilians, she was a protector. To enemies, a ghost. To the SEALs, she was the story they would carry long after the sand and blood faded. The story of the woman who transformed before their eyes, who balanced the impossible, and who proved that even in the heart of war humanity could still fire straighter than any rifle. And so, in whispers across camps, in the silence of Reeves's memory, in the restless dreams of Kane and the others, her name lived on. Not as just a medic, not as just a marksman, but as the one who had become both. The one they called Unforgettable. The end.